So welcome everybody to the Cynthia Irwin-Williams Lectureship. This is the 26th annual event that's sponsored by the Anthropology Department and the Anthropology Club here, Mu Alpha Nu. So tonight, this is the first time we actually have two presenters giving the lecture, so pretty exciting. And those individuals are Dr. Steve Nash and Paul Reed, who are joining us from Archaeology Southwest. Dr. Nash received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Arizona and is currently the president and CEO of Archaeology Southwest. Throughout his career, he has held various positions at the Chicago Field Museum and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. While at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, Nash led significant collaborative projects to return belongings to indigenous North American communities and indigenous people internationally. Dr. Nash is a successful fundraiser and has raised more than $34 million. Yes, that's 6 zeros on there. From private and federal sources for projects ranging from research to institutional growth. Since 2015, Dr. Nash has written Curiosities, a regular column on anthropological topics for the digital magazine Sapiens. Paul Reed is the New Mexico State Director for Archaeology Southwest and has been a preservation archaeologist with that organization since 2001. He works extensively with Southern Pueblos and tribes to protect landscapes and elevate indigenous voices. Over the last decade, Reed has been working to protect the greater Chaco landscape from the effects of expanded oil and gas development associated with fracking. In 2022, Reed and award-winning filmmaker David Wallace produced a short documentary film titled Protecting Chaco's 10-Mile Zone, which received a Rocky Mountain Southwest Chapter Regional Emmy in 2023. Reed has published and edited numerous works, including Foundations of Anasazi Culture in 2000, The Puebloan Society of Chaco Canyon in 2004, the 3-volume comprehensive report entitled 35 Years of Archaeological Research at Salmon Ruins, New Mexico in 2006, Chaco's Northern Prodigies, Salmon, Aztec, and the Ascendancy of the Middle San Juan region after AD 1100 in 2008, and most recently, Aztec, Salmon, and the Pueblo heartland of the Middle San Juan in 2018. Their talk tonight is also unique because it's the first time the talk is actually about Cynthia Irwin-Williams and her work. The title of the talk is The CIW Express, Cynthia Irwin-Williams in North American Archaeology in the 20th Century. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Nash and Paul Reed.
Thank you, Brendan.
No problem.
Online folks, you're going to be looking at the slides. I tend to wander, so if all of a sudden you can't hear my voice, just put a note in the chat and I'll start wandering a little bit less. All right, folks. How many of you have heard of Archaeology Southwest? Oh, that's cool. All right. Archaeology Southwest is a nonprofit in Tucson, Arizona that's been there for 40 years. And I took over as president and CEO from the founding CEO a year ago. And Paul and I had crossed paths a few times over the last couple of decades, but didn't really know each other. And so one of my jobs as new president and CEO is to share the wealth about Archaeology Southwest, what we do and why we do it. So I'm going to do a little bit of public service announcement here first. But when Brandon contacted me about giving this lecture, I am the guy that is stupid enough to think that a named lecture series is about the person that it's named after. So when I went and gave the Fred Wendorf lecture at SMU, I had a big chunk about Fred Wendorf, and nobody told me that you weren't supposed to do that. In any case, I will argue, and Paul will follow up with me on this. I think that we're uniquely qualified to provide some additional insights into Cynthia Irwin-Williams, because I was at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science for 17 years. I'm a historian of science. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a collections person. I've spent my entire career trying to make better use out of previously excavated, already curated collections. And as we'll see, as you heard in the video, Cynthia Irwin-Williams had a long-standing relationship with the Denver Museum of Natural History that I'm going to talk about and its implications. Paul, on the other hand, bookends this because his career, he did a ton of work at Salmon Ruins that he's going to talk about. And of course, that was one of the major excavations that Cynthia Irwin-Williams led during her career. So when Brendan asked me if I would do this, I said, yeah, I'm going to talk about Cynthia Irwin-Williams, but we got to get Paul involved. And, you know, personally, Paul and I don't get to see each other that often. So coming together and having the chance to share some time together is also a blessing. So thank you all for making that happen. All right. Archaeology Southwest. There aren't many archaeology nonprofits anywhere in the world, but there aren't many that have a 40-year legacy and do all of the things that we do. So yes, I'm going to be a little bit bombastic here for a minute, but again, it's germane to Cynthia Irwin-Williams and her career. What we do is it's under the rubric of preservation archaeology, a holistic and conservation-based approach to exploring and protecting heritage places while honoring their diverse values. And as Paul will talk about, that honoring their diverse values is critically important. It's not only critically important in 2025, it has been critically important in our discipline for a little while. But it wasn't critically important during Cynthia Irwin-Williams' time, and we'll talk about that. So we compile archaeological information. We make it accessible and understandable. Our newest magazine just came out yesterday. It's a 64-page glossy introduction to the archaeology of Mesa Verde National Park. It's fantastic. If you join, we can send you a copy. We share this information with the public and with decision makers. We're currently involved in a lawsuit to prohibit the Sunzia pipeline transmission line from going through the San Pedro Valley. We lost. The transmission line is going through right now as we speak. They're putting the lines up. There's another transmission line that's going to go after it, the Rio Sol transmission line. Those transmission lines are bringing renewable energy from New Mexico, taking it to California. The Sunzia pipeline transmission line doesn't even drop off any electricity in Arizona. It just goes right through the state. We said, well, why can't you just go down the I-10 corridor? It's already industrialized. Why do you have to go through this pristine landscape? We lost. We're still in the court battle. There's a hearing tomorrow, in fact, but we're going to keep up the fight to preserve these sites, preserve these landscapes as we go forth. So we're engaged in advocacy and public policy and so on. As I said, landscape scale protection, and then we preserve sites, and now we're starting to preserve collections. When I took the job at Archaeology Southwest, I had a little bit of imposter syndrome, because I work on cultural heritage that is preserved in museums, objects, collections, ancestors, things like that, repatriating, doing returns, properly curating stuff. And Archaeology Southwest had largely been over here on the spectrum of sites and landscapes, except for that guy who does collections at Salmon Ruin. And so I was like, wait a minute, Paul's doing this. And then with tribal nations, many tribal nations, it's all the same continuum, isn't it? It's objects, it's sites, it's landscapes, it's all their culture. So I was engaging in a little bit of deconstruction in, you know, for my imposter syndrome or something like that. But Archaeology Southwest does all of those things. And we're committed to real and ongoing collaboration with Indigenous communities. Again, as Paul will touch on a little bit when he starts talking about Cynthia's work at Salmon Pueblo. Two other things that might be of interest to you right now in 2025. Last year, we published a model for tribal collaboration. It's a short paper. It's on our website. But it's how we engage in tribal collaboration. Because what we hear from a lot of people is they say, I want to do tribal collaboration, but I don't know how. I mean, literally, it's a mechanical thing. And I'm like, no, it's not a mechanical thing. It's a social thing. Treat people with respect. Recognize that you've got to understand what their interests are as well as yours. And that's a good starting place. Exchanging gifts. Read the book. Everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten. And that's a good start. Play nice. Don't take other people's stuff, things like that. So look up a model for tribal collaboration. This was written with Skylar Begay, who is Diné, Navajo, and Ashley Thompson, who is Red Lake Ojibwe. But the 4 R's in this model, relationships, be a good relative. And that's relative in the cosmic sense, not in the genetic sense. It's the cosmic sense. Be a good relative. You've got a responsibility. And one of the elders that we talked with said, forget your rights, remember your responsibilities. I tell that to my children every week, because we're all, you know, up in arms about our rights. Well, what are your responsibilities? Reciprocity. It's a mutual exchange of privileges. Redistribution to achieve greater social equality. All of those R's they drive the tribal collaboration that we do at Archaeology Southwest. And then we've also got a paper online, a tribal co-management paper. How do tribes and the federal government or state government or local government co-manage a site or landscape? There are legal agreements in which they're co-managed. Bears eaters? Yes? Yes. Bears Ears National Monument is co-managed between the federal government and 5 tribes. The 5 tribes that were involved. So it's a thing, tribal co-management. And then we're working on an indigenous data sovereignty model right now, and that's a hard one. But we've had people involved in projects that look at faunal collections. Return from an archaeological site. Are faunal remains considered sacred? Are they cultural patrimony? Do they have any place under NAGPRA? We could argue that point, but there is an issue about indigenous data sovereignty, and we're trying to tackle that in collaboration with the tribes. So that's very quickly who we are and what we do as an institution, as Archaeology Southwest, and that's the last I'm going to say about that. What about me? Why am I here talking about Cynthia Irwin-Williams? I never met her, wasn't one of her students, but I've been in museums for a very long time. That is my dad at the Field Museum editing an issue of Fieldiana that was on Carter Ranch Pueblo that Paul Martin excavated for the Field Museum. That is 1963. Notice he's got a cigarette in his right hand. I'm just saying, right? That's me and my brother in 1967 at the Field Museum with an exhibit on Yoruba twin statues. So that ran in the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago twins meet Yoruba twins or something like that. I was lucky enough to hold a position at the Field Museum 33 years later, and I got a grant to work on those same statues. And my brother and I reconstructed that photograph. Didn't tell our mom. She got the newsletter, opened it up, and she actually liked us for a second there. But I've been in this business a really long time. I hold museums near and dear to my heart. And museums have taken a bum rap in the last 10 years, and it's legitimate. Museums have done some bad things, but if the last column I published in Sapiens magazine is called In Defense of Museums. And I do believe that museums play a role in our society for no other reason than that back in the day, the only way to learn about the rest of the world, aside from a bad David Attenborough documentary, National Geographic, and your library, was to go to the museum. We weren't learning about it by personal travel. There was no internet. There wasn't other kinds of things. So museums served a purpose. Did they do some harm? Absolutely. But I believe that museums are forces for good. I worked at the Museum of Science and Industry when I was in high school, giving coal mine tours and so on. That's up in Chicago. I worked at the Field Museum for 9 years, not in that era. That's 1924. Look at those people, though, making a pilgrimage to the Greco-Roman Temple for Knowledge. That's when it opened. Look at that. Holy smokes. People were starved for this kind of information that museums can provide. And then I worked for 17 years at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, which Brandon Asher worked at in 2010, 11. Yeah, so I met Brandon there when you were just a wee little intern, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Steve Hall. Throughout the course of my career, trying to make these collections available, I studied the history of archaeology at the Field Museum and the history of archaeology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And I'm going to talk about a really remarkable lady that was at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science in the context of Cynthia Irwin-Williams' work. Cynthia Irwin-Williams is an enigma because she exists everywhere in some ways and she exists nowhere. And the only time that I've been to Portales was to bring Brennan eight banker's boxes of archives of Cynthia Irwin-Williams that were at the Smithsonian. Why were they at the Smithsonian? There wasn't an exhibit of Cynthia Irwin-Williams at the Smithsonian. They were there because George Agogino gave them to Dennis Stanford, who said, she's important, I'm going to hold on to these things. And then Dennis Stanford checks out, not having done these things. So people would come to me in Denver and say, hey, you've got the Cynthia Irwin-Williams archives. No, we don't. Those are, where are they? Nobody knew. Nobody knows. There isn't a stash of Cynthia Irwin-Williams papers at any one institution. And that's a tragedy. It's also the case with Hannah Marie Wormington, and I'll talk about that in a minute. All right, some of this you got in the video. I'm going to rehash it just because there's a couple of important points that I want to make. Born in 1936, Denver, Colorado. My folks were born in 35 and 37. She could have been my parents. Gets a BA at Radcliffe College, Harvard University, master's in 1958, 1 year later. How many of you can get a master's 1 year after your BA? None. Faculty, we got to change that, right? What's changed in the discipline? I don't know. But you could get a master's degree in 1 year. It doesn't happen like that anymore. PhD 5 years later. That doesn't happen either. Is archaeology really that complicated? I don't know. I can't wait to talk to you three after this talk, because you all are keep looking at each other saying, what is this guy doing? What is he talking about? I'm being obnoxious. Got to keep people awake. Thank you, by the way, all you undergraduates up in the back, thank you for joining us. I know 7:30 and or 7:20 is not your ideal time of day, but thank you for coming. Cynthia Irwin-Williams gets married, either 62 or 63, I'm not sure which, to David Williams. Cynthia Irwin gets married to David Williams. Why am I bringing that up when I'm talking about a scholar? Does it really matter who they marry? In this case, it did, because David Williams got a job at Sandia Labs, which meant in their dinner time talks, they talked about who was going to be quote unquote stable, who was going to take the primary position, and who's got to find a job based around that. So Cynthia Irwin-Williams takes a job here, 200 miles away. She's going back and forth, 200-mile commute in her VW bug every week. That will take its toll on a career. Just saying. 64, she gets the job here. There's that 200-mile commute. I should say also, this was mentioned in the video. Cynthia Irwin and her brother Henry started volunteering at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science when they were teenagers, 14 and 12 years old. How many of you started volunteering in museums when you were 12 or 14? They were remarkable individuals. They took the initiative to do that. Wormington took them under her wing. Why? Doesn't matter, but she did. Mentors are critically important, but Cynthia Irwin was under Marie Wormington's wing for a very long time. And we have to give Marie Wormington credit, which I will do here in just a second. And then she gets the job at Desert Research Institute, so on, dies of congestive heart failure, age 54. There's her biography. Not held by any one institution. You have to piece it together from a number of different institutions. Her research sites, 1954 to 57, she and her brother were excavating sites under the tutelage of Marie Wormington. They were teenagers excavating sites legitimately. Nobody cast aspersions at them. And they published it in the Denver Museum of Natural History series as teenagers. It's incredible. Were they geniuses? They were pretty doggone smart. They were pretty doggone dedicated, but they had Marie Wormington going to bat for them. And she was a force of nature. Magic Mountain site, 1957 to 59 in Golden, Colorado, a multi-component archaic site, really, really important site in the cultural history of the Front Range as a whole. It formed the basis of her dissertation research at Harvard University. I put Michelle Kuhn's name in parentheses under there. Michelle is a curator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I worked with her for 10 years up there. She started digging at Magic Mountain again after Irwin-Williams. Collections folk out there, this is one of the problems, but this is one of the radical changes that has happened. We used to get inquiries about Magic Mountain at Denver, people saying, hey, you got the collection that Irwin-Williams made in her dissertation? And we said, nope, well, where is it? It's at Harvard. In 2014, I was on an NEH panel with the collections manager from the Harvard Peabody. And I said, hey, you think we could get those Irwin-Williams collections from Magic Mountain back? Because everybody thinks they're with us, not with you. And he said, oh, no, we can't do that. I said, why not? And he said, because our policy is not to reunite collections. And then he said something which blew me away even more, which was that Harvard University, if they stopped, Peabody Museum, if they stopped collecting, which they weren't going to do, if they stopped, it would take them 60 years to catalog their priority collections. And the Magic Mountain site wasn't even on their priority list. So what they were insisting in action, if not in word, was that Cynthia Irwin-Williams' primary persona as an archaeologist was as a graduate student at Harvard University. Everything else be damned. And then George Floyd comes along, and then the ProPublica article about repatriation comes along, and Harvard and a new director of the Peabody Museum comes along, and they've changed their tune entirely. We reburied ancestors that Cynthia Irwin-Williams excavated from Magic Mountain. We reburied them last August at Magic Mountain in full collaboration with Ute Mountain Ute, Southern Ute, Pawnee, so on. Those ancestors have been returned to Mother Earth. And there might be some interest, some hope in getting the rest of the Magic Mountain collections, which are uncatalogued at Peabody, to Denver, which has the space and the staff to do it. Key point in all of this, if you're an archaeologist, don't be personally possessive about your collections. They are not your collections. And people say, my collection, because when you're gone, it's an institutional legacy, and that's a pain in the butt. So curation is one of your responsibilities. Again, the discipline is moving away from this, but I've spent my career cataloging previously excavated collections. There's my rant. All right. She goes out, starts digging at Hell Gap, Wyoming, one of the type site for the Hell Gap phase in Paleo-Indian work. working with George Agostino from here and with Vance Haynes. 64 to 71, she's also digging at Arroyo Cuervo. Notice two projects going at the same time, overlapping. She describes the Oshara tradition and the Picosa, what was it, Picosa culture. She would make up names for these cultures and so on. I remember reading it as an undergraduate. I forgot about it then, forgive me. But she was making critical contributions into science at that young age. And then she goes to Salmon Pueblo in 69, starts the San Juan Valley Project, coins the term Chaco phenomenon, etc. in the early 70s. Paul's going to talk about that in just a second. Point here is that the woman did not lack in confidence, so far as I know. She just went out and did it. And that comes, I think, a lot from Hannah Marie Wormington's tutelage, which we'll get into. The agony of Valsequillo. It's one of the sites that Cynthia Irwin's dug in Mexico with geoscientists. They tried new dating techniques on there. Radiocarbon dates said, well, they said there were tools and there was extinct fauna there. No big surprise. We see that at Clovis, we see it at Folsom, we see it elsewhere. Radiocarbon dating said that the bones are 35,000 years old. The uranium series date said they were 250,000 years old. Guess which ones the media picked up on? 250,000 years. And Cynthia Irwin-Williams said, don't publish it, don't associate my name with that and so on. But it was too late. The word had gotten out. She was the archaeologist associated with an early human site, way too early human site in the Americas. And she spent a lot of time trying to dig herself out of that hole, as it were. So there's the story. Geological Society of America, the presentation was there. The media would be there. It made its way into the papers. And I bring this up through the history of archaeology. A.E. Douglas, who developed tree ring dating, would tell his students, you need to be infernally sure of your results before they get into the media. And I love that phrase. You got to be infernally sure. Keep that in mind. Because if you've got a sensational result and it gets out there, there's no getting back. And this is before the internet. That was viral, right? Cynthia Irwin-Williams was dealing with viral results. And it hurt her career for a long time. All right. Wrapping up my contribution. There is the queen, Hannah Marie Wormington. She was at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science for 33 years. She went to East High School in Denver, as did Cynthia Irwin-Williams. She went to the University of Denver in Denver. She went to Harvard University. There was a 14-year gap between her BA and her PhD because of the war and other kinds of things. But Marie Wormington, so she was there at the Denver Museum of Natural History for 33 years. She wrote the best-selling archaeology textbook when she was 24. How many of you were 24? No 24-year-olds in here? One, Lauren. Well, you got some work to do. Crank out a book next year. Can you imagine in a man's world, in a discipline that is dominated by men? We heard it in the video. We know this. Dominated by men. And she writes the best-selling textbook. Went through multiple editions at age 24. Chutzpah. We have to turn to the Yiddish sometimes to get the right word out. Chutzpah. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. And then she mentors Cynthia Irwin-Williams' work throughout the 50s. She arranges for the dissertation work at Magic Mountain. But she gets fired by the Denver Museum of Nature and Science in 1968. Remember that fundraising thing for me he was talking about? When I got the job in Denver, there was a guy who had given 6 different $1 million gifts. Joe Kramer gives 6 different $1 million gifts. Mind you, this is 2007. I meet him and he comes up and I'm chair of the department. He says, Steve, you know why I'm not going to give you $1 million? And I said, no, Joe, I have no idea. And he said, because you fired Marie Wormington in 1968. 39 years later. A toxic asset at best. But she lived a mile away from the museum for a long time. They ultimately gave her emeritus status in 1988 and maybe made amends. I don't know. But Marie Wormington was a force of nature. And Vance Haynes, the dean of Paleo-Indian archaeology, tells the story of how they would go to Marie's house after every field season. All the Paleo-Indian archaeologists, all the men, would go to Marie's house and say, this is what we find. And they were seeking her approval. And they wanted her approval. And if she wasn't going to approve, she would tell them right then and there. But there was this exodus I don't know, what is it? This migration of scholars to Denver to go and get the approval of Marie Wormington. So she carved an unusual niche for herself in a world that was dominated by men. And I would argue that Cynthia Irwin-Williams did the same thing. It was a different trajectory, but it's hard not to see the mentor and the mentee as being deeply related in their precociousness, in their audacity, in their talent, in their brain, and all of that kind of stuff. So that's what I've got to say. I'm going to turn it over to Paul after showing you what museum work looked like Zoom back in the day. That's Marie Wormington on TV in Denver doing a show, and I just love it because it's it's drawings in the back and a couple of stone stuff, and it's just a very different world back then. Anyway, I'd never met either one of them. They both died under tragic circumstances, but both remarkable women in the history of our discipline. Paul, take it away.
Thank you. Well, you're a tough act to follow, Steve, but I will do my best. So yeah, this is the site at Salmon Ruin or Salmon Pueblo. This is about a 1972 aerial photo. And let's set it in context and time. So Steve said, and it's very true, the work that I've done now for about the last 15 years out of about 25 Archaeology Southwest has focused on working with tribes. So I used to show maps that looked like this before that had no tribal lands. And that wasn't out of any intent of my own to avoid that. But when I started putting this on there, it's like, wow, we've got all these ancient places we're studying, right? And who are the descendants of these ancient places? Okay. One of the things that has happened extensively in American archaeology, we've divorced the ancient cultures, the so-called prehistoric cultures, from the living peoples. One of the things we do at Archaeology Southwest is we stop doing that. We are now connecting them integrally from the past to the present. In fact, we don't even use the word prehistoric. You can consider it semantic or PC or whatever, but I talk about the history of these places because prehistory means nothing to me anymore. That's something I've stripped away. I don't care when people started writing things down at all. I care about this history. And if we call it prehistory, we're divorcing it from the tribal peoples, indigenous peoples who live all around the special places that we want to study, especially in the Pueblo North that I focus on. So we have Chaco Canyon, we have Salmon ruins, Aztec ruins, we have Navajo Nation lands, the Navajos came in later, but we have Pueblo lands, other lands all around it. So let's talk about the history of these areas and understand that nobody got beamed off. Okay, the word Anasazi is a terrible word to use, and I will talk a little bit about that if folks are interested, because that divorces Pueblo people in the present from their Pueblo past. Okay, and it's not even a Pueblo word, it's a Dene word that has a history that I could talk about in a different lecture. Let's talk about Pueblo history. Let's talk about indigenous history, and let's try to do it right. Okay, so Salmon Pueblo sits. Salmon Pueblo, Salmon Ruins sits right here on the San Juan River. We are in a direct line 45 miles north of Chaco. This was the thing that Cynthia brought to this. When she went up to begin work on the site, one of the things that she developed very early was the Chaco phenomenon that Steve talked about. Cynthia was the catalyst for understanding that. The interesting thing is at the same time, the folks in Chaco were doing a big project, working at Pueblo Alto and a number of different places. So there was synergy that developed between these two places. That drove a lot of what we understand about Chaco, what we understand about Salmon, what we understand about this complicated but very interesting Pueblo history. Okay, so let's go back in time. This is Salmon Pueblo. This is actually about 1982. Adriel Heisey is an amazing aerial photographer. He has an ultralight airplane, and he essentially went around the Southwest, driving this plane and essentially stalling over sites to get amazing photographs. We've had a long-running exhibit where he reshot all of Lindbergh's photographs from 1929. So Charles Lindbergh flew across the American Southwest, took a series of amazing shots. Adriel went back in the 80s and duplicated those. We have these beautiful shots of Salmon. Okay, it's 1969. The site doesn't look like this at all. Cynthia has been invited by the local San Juan County Museum Association based in Bloomfield and Aztec, New Mexico, to come look at a site that maybe she should excavate. She's like, okay, I'll go look at it. She climbs a hill off the highway in Bloomfield, okay, about a 6-meter hill. to look at the site, and she's looking around going, okay, you dragged me out here. Where's this whatever site? They said you're standing on it. So Cynthia, by perhaps apocryphal lore only, stepped away, said a few words I won't repeat, and then walked back over and said, okay, I'll do it. So it's 1969. She kicked off an 11-year project to study Salmon Pueblo, Salmon ruins, in as much of its entirety as she could. She raised about $4 million in 1970s dollars to do that work. So you can do that math. This was lots and lots of money that was brought in to do this. Okay, so why am I standing here talking to you? Bill Doley went on a preservation tour, and Bill is Steve's predecessor. He's the founder of this organization. He went up to the Four Corners in 2000. Bill had gotten a large anonymous gift of $1 million. He wanted to branch out from Tucson, Archaeology Southwest, then the Center for Desert Archaeology. Bill also had Desert Archaeology, a very well-reputationed, if you will, CRM firm in Tucson. Bill wanted to get outside of Tucson into a different area. He came up to the Four Corners. He visited Salmon ruins. He began to talk to people about the issues there and said, this is where I want to do a reinvestment program. So I was fortunate to be in the area. I had spent 15 years working for Navajo Nation as an archaeologist across the northern Navajo reservation. And I was hired in 2001 to do that work. We ran this program primarily between about 01 and 06, with another short phase from 2015 to 2021. So over about 20 years of this, we brought in grants from NSF, NEH, you can read them all up here, really about every grant funding organization. And we brought in about $3 million total dollars in investment in Salmon through labor, time, all the grants. So this was intended over this time period to basically bring fruition to Cynthia's work, to the work of the people from Eastern, all the volunteers. Something like 700 people worked at Salmon ruins between 1969 and 1979. So this was what I was hired to do. I called this the day job for about 5 years. We put out 3 volumes on this. We did this publication in 08, which brought in scholars from the original project, a whole bunch of new people. We did new faunal studies. Kathy Roller Duran from here did extensive fauna work. Steve Duran consulted with us. What a loss to lose Steve when we did. Many people were involved in this, and I feel like we perhaps helped to bring some fruition to one of Cynthia's amazing projects. So what did Cynthia actually do at Salmon Pueblo? I already said to you, and Steve did, the Chaco phenomenon, okay? That didn't come from Jim Judge, great archaeologist, Chacoan archaeologist, Bob Lister. It came from Cynthia. She coined the term, people picked it up. She was interested in a systematic approach to the study of ancient Chacoan society. She felt, after going to Salmon, doing some initial work, that it represented a Chacoan colony outside the main parts of Chaco Canyon. And to this day, I think that is still the single best explanation for why Salmon was founded when it was. She brought a relatively new approach in archaeology in the late 60s, a regional approach. She wasn't just going to go dig a single site and maybe do a little bit of survey. She wanted to work at a large site, do a comprehensive survey of the 3 valleys, the La Plata, the Animas, the San Juan, in this middle San Juan zone. And she basically brought a new perspective to the study of Pueblo sites. So Cynthia was primarily a Paleo-Indian and Archaic period archaeologist. She had never taken on a project like this. So the project went through some growing pains, but I think she brought a very fresh perspective. And as Steve said, and the video said, she really helped break some of the good old boy network that totally existed in archaeology at that time. And I think most importantly, perhaps, Cynthia was a people person. Anyone who knew her knows that. She brought a lot of stray dogs and puppies, the way she talked about it. She had students who were pretty much lost. She brought them into Salmon, she gave them jobs, and she launched a lot of careers that way. And I think that is perhaps one of her greatest contributions to all this. I will tell you, I never met Cynthia. I was telling John Montgomery, before we started. I had a Cynthia sighting in 1990. She died in 1990. I saw her at the SAAs in Las Vegas and did not have the opportunity to meet her, but what a phenomenal, amazing woman. Okay, so we're in the 1970s. What's going on? Well, again, this concept of regional archaeology just beginning. We're making this transition away from single site, single cultural groups. We're trying to understand these large regions. Well, guess what was happening? This massive NPS project at Chaco that ran about 1968 to 1983, plus or minus. So these two groups of people were working, Salmon and Chaco, and they were meeting every summer, several times during the summer, to try and understand these two amazing places together at the same time. We had a lot of synergy, a lot of things back and forth with these folks. I think the time was absolutely ripe at that point to crack this Chaco thing. And Cynthia had a huge role in that. So what did we do? A systematic and regional approach to studying ancient Chacoan society. She excavated a huge Chacoan site. Cynthia was a supporter of, really a purveyor of a multidisciplinary approach. She had a ceramics lab. She had a lithics lab. She had a computer lab. She had a faunal lab. She had soil scientists. She had biologists. And it's not that these things were unheard of in archaeology, but putting them all into one single big project, that was a feat. She also implemented a regional survey in the greater San Juan valleys, and she instituted one of the first computer data retrieval and analysis systems. You know, the folks who've been around, you can remember mainframe, running it through the mainframes, putting a program up to run. Steve and Larry Baker, who was Salmon's director for years, would talk about setting the mainframe to run a program, and you literally had to go somewhere because it was going to take 15 or 20 minutes to do a very simple routine that today we can do with our software like that. When I came to Salmon to work on it, part of the archive I was working with were 9mm backup tapes that were about this size, and they had lots of data. Well, I got a bunch of those translated with a place in Texas. Most of those tapes held about 300 kilobytes with a KB of data, not megabytes, kilobytes. So we were able to recover some of that. But they had a computer system and they cranked everything through that. I will say that I think they had only limited success actually getting things to come back out of that. They still did a lot of analysis and data sheets, and fortunately, because not all the computer stuff worked. Okay, so what did Cynthia do at Salmon then? Again, we're going to come back to the people. She was an amazing mentor to dozens, if not hundreds, of younger archaeologists and scholars. First generation Cynthia students, Larry Baker, a longtime director of Salmon Ruins, Steve Durand, of course, with an amazing career here, taken from us way too soon. A large host of folks that I call Salmonites, students who worked either at Salmon or in the Puerco Valley, who got their start under Cynthia, many, many others. Second generation, Tori Myers, who is currently the Salmon Ruins Museum Director, was here as a grad student 20 years ago. Jason Meiniger, same situation. So this connection between Eastern and Salmon is very long and deep. And it all started with Cynthia. Couple of shots here. Yes, it was the 1970s. Okay. Cynthia's field schools and the work at Salmon was infamous for the partying. Okay. You guys may have heard stories. And of course, I wasn't there, but everything you've heard from any other field project, any other field school, anywhere in the Southwest, it all happened at Salmon too. They would do these full day weekend naked soirees from the site down to the San Juan River. There was photographic evidence I never saw. Cynthia was in the field doing field work. So this was not a woman who said, you guys go dig the site. I'm going to be sitting here doing this. Okay. That cute picture of her on the left. I love that. She's in the field. She's understanding the strata. Again, we saw this in the film. She's out there. She's teaching students. What I understand about Cynthia's field skills is that they were paramount, that she knew how to read soils. And that was the legacy of being a Paleo-Indian and archaic archaeologist. She brought that approach to Salmon and I think helped crack the stratigraphy of a very complicated 3 or 4 meter deep Pueblo site. She was out working in the deep weeds, the tall grass. She loved the Puerto River Valley. So this is just up a little bit northwest of Albuquerque. The Arroyo Cuervo project is up there. Steve Duran and others here worked at Mesa Prieta for years. That's just a little bit up northwest of this region. Cynthia, I think, from what I've come to understand about her, loved field work, and that's where she found some of her greatest satisfaction. And again, she's in there, she's moving dirt. She's throwing dirt. She's helping to understand stratigraphy. This is in one of the kivas at Salmon. And she's posing. Her black pants, her white shirt, her beret. I think with what Steve said, what others have said, she had tremendous impact on this field and really should be someone that all of you at Eastern understand her legacy as well as you can and realize that she launched many things. Well, I'm going to stop there. This is a beautiful little reconstruction of Salmon that Doug Gann, who used to work with us, did as the rain clouds fell. I know Steve and I are glad to take any questions y'all might have. Yeah.
I guess one thing I don't know if it was really thinking on was what is the Chaco phenomenon?
Wow.
I'm not taking that one.
Well, you guys have time to stay till midnight. In short, it's the development of these amazing multi-story buildings, okay? The trade networks which brought macaws, cacao beans, up to Chaco from Mesoamerica, some indication of Mesoamerican influence, and then the construction of more than 300 places across the four corners in the 4 states that had a Chacoan footprint or the stamp of Chacoan culture in contact. So, and it was clear in the late 60s, as people were doing regional surveys, starting to understand road networks, that that was happening, and Chaco wasn't just Chaco confined to the canyon, that it had spread out all the way across the four corner states. So that was what Cynthia was primarily interested in addressing through the excavation of not a site in Chaco, because that was Park Service turf. And if we know anything in archaeology, turf matters a lot. But she was given this window, this opportunity by this local museum association in San Juan County that, by the way, bought a site at Salmon in '69 that was threatened with purchase by a pot hunter. There was a guy who bought the site in the late 50s, intended to get Smithsonian or some quote prestigious organization in the East interested. He failed for 10 years, this guy. He put it on the market for sale, and the locals basically got together and said, we need to raise $10,000 to buy the site. So they did that before Cynthia got there. That was 68, 69. She came, understood she was supposed to dig not a 20-room Pueblo, but a 250-room plus one. And then in those couple of years of initial study, developed the idea of a Chaco phenomenon. So that's Reader's Digest.
One aspect of the Chaco phenomenon from my world, which is tree ring dating, there were 250,000 trees cut down 50 miles away from Chaco Canyon and then carried. There's no way they did it in water. They didn't have draft animals. They didn't have a wheel. They were carried 50 plus miles to Chaco Canyon to construct those great houses. Monumental amount of labor involved in that, and some experiments recently up at the University of Colorado at Boulder, of course. Tuck lines, instead of carrying it in Navy SEAL style like this, use tuck lines, get 4 people across using tuck lines, and it's actually easier to carry them that way. Maybe one argument for why those chocolate roads are just wide enough to fit one of those beams. Just saying, that's all I know about chocolate.
Good.
I'll jump in. Alice Kehoe of Marquette University has done a lot of writing about the history of archaeology. She too got a PhD at Harvard in the early 1960s, and she's done a lot of great deconstructive of our discipline. If you want to read some really provocative stuff, read Alice Kehoe's critique of our discipline. It sort of carries on. Well, I would love to have seen Cynthia Irwin-Williams, Alice Kehoe, Marie Wormington, and a couple of others in a room talking about all this kind of stuff.
That'd be crazy.
It'd be crazy.
It'd be wild.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for our graduate students, undergrads?
On what specifically?
I'll leave it up to y'all.
I've got it down to sound bites now. And I'm serious. Follow your head and your heart, not your wallet, because you're not gonna be doing this for money. You can always make more money, but you can't make more time, you can't, and it's really hard to make more opportunity. And I say this because I have a genetic clone walking this earth. I have an identical twin brother who went for the money and not for the heart and for the mind, and it didn't serve him well. It's really hard to make it in this business. I used to say you gotta be, Bonnie Pueblo, who was here a few years ago to give this lecture. I was talking with her one time, we went to graduate school together, and I said, you know, to make it in this business, you gotta be lucky, you gotta be good, you gotta be perseverant. And you control two of those variables. And she said, Steve, that's not right. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, you gotta be lucky, you gotta be excellent, and you gotta be perseverant, and you still only control two of those variables.
I would add to that, find something you love to study and do and pursue it. Because if you have that interest and that passion, that's gonna carry you through. If you end up with a job, perhaps like Steve's twin, that you make a lot of money at, but you hate, the days are way too long, not enough weekends, not enough vacations. So find something you wanna do and do it.
And we were talking with Joanna and Tara and Scott and Lauren earlier about what's the worst job you've ever had and why. And I actually asked this in job interviews, specifically to get at whether or not people have worked food service, office management, or retail in the past. And if they haven't, they're gonna have to convince me that they actually know how to work. And one guy who could end up in the National Academy of Sciences one someday said to me, worst job I ever had was being an assistant field crew chief on a survey in China. Okay, why was that hard? Language barrier. All right, that was probably hard, but that's not what I'm talking about. And if you can learn how to be bored in your own discipline, because you're gonna be bored from time to time, like Paul was saying, if you can handle the boredom from the discipline that you love, you're gonna be fine. But if you're bored and you hate what you're doing, you're in deep, deep trouble. The other thing is, what I would say is it's never gonna get easier to move about the planet and take opportunities than it is right now for you all. Go do it. I was talking with Tim McCune, an ACRA guy who just retired from the feds, and we were talking about funding and all that kind of stuff, and he said, always apply. The worst they can do is tell you no, you don't get the application, but you have to apply to get the money, to get the opportunity and so on. You have to apply, always apply. So that's a short one right there, just always apply. And funding matters, I'm not gonna lie, get the book Proposals That Work, read it, learn it, know how to write grant proposals, heck, know how to schlep the wow, right? There are many, many people in this world who love what people in this room do, but couldn't figure out how to do it for themselves. So I've spent my career marrying up the opportunities that Paul and I can provide with people with disposable income, and my God, is there a lot of disposable income in this country. And people are looking for opportunities to come out and interact with archaeologists on a daily basis. You're not paying to dig anymore, hopefully. But there are ways to schlep our wow to them. You don't tell them about your research. Find out what's interesting to them and see if you can marry up that opportunity.
Federal funding is very uncertain right now, right? And my wife has called me Captain Obvious, so I'm gonna say it. We are looking much more heavily at private donors, exactly the stuff Steve's talking about. I'm not saying you're an undergrad, you're a graduate, you need to start doing this, but this is probably a good part of our future in archaeology. We have a catastrophic 3.5 years left. Who knows what's left after that? So get your elevator speeches down, learn what you're interested in, find your passion, and find a rich person to pitch it to.
And I'm saying it now, apply for those small grants as often as any kind of money that you can list on your CV. That says, I got that competitive grant, I got that. It is compelling, because all the deans and all the faculty members are wondering how they're gonna pay for these programs going forward. And if you can bring money to the table, that's a good thing. Now, I'm gonna ask you about what's tainted money and what's not tainted money. In Colorado, at the museum, we ignored cannabis money. Cannabis has been legal in Colorado since 2014. It is $1 billion a year industry, mostly in cash, with good-hearted people. We had the Coors Gem and Mineral Hall at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Coors beer, but we wouldn't take money from cannabis. What's up with that? There was a woman, the Amarin Foundation, in Dragoon, Arizona, a Dene woman, and I don't wanna put words in her mind, but I was talking about this with somebody last week. And they were talking about what's dirty money, what's tainted money. Well, you can't take it from Raytheon because they build missiles that blow up the world. Or you can't take money from somebody else, an oil and gas company that's chewing up the American West, as Paul well knows. And her response was, all of that money was made on tribal lands. So let's get every bit of it back that we can. And then let's spend it to rectify those harms. Breathtaking, breathtakingly clear. So no, I won't take money from everybody, but I'm gonna think about wherever I can get it for this business. Cause nobody's paying for us to do this just cause they wanna pay us to do it anymore. The days are long though. We gotta work at it. And you shouldn't be embarrassed about it. Tell them about Chopper Canyon and the work that you did to get the 10-mile oil and gas barrier, buffalo, whatever they called it.
Yeah, so
This guy did it.
we started in 2012 to work with BLM in Farmington through this endless resource management plan amendment process. BLM manages through these RMPs across the state, across the West. And they wanted to allow wells basically right up to Chaco's door. So we got together with other environmental groups, NPCA, National Parks, Conservation, Wilderness, all the big ones, and a whole bunch of tribes. And we jumped into these meetings. We went to all the meetings. We started saying, no, we want a zone. We want a protective zone. Tribes started out saying we want 30 miles. Well, 30 miles takes you through the heart of some of the best oil and gas producing areas that are just northeast of Chaco. And we thought there's no way we can do that. So we compromised to 10 miles. And then I did a big study about 5 years ago to look at as many of those sites in the 10-mile zone as possible to see, okay, this is a buffer zone of sorts, although I like protection zone more. In there is something like 150,000 sites we projected inside that 10-mile zones. And it's actually a series of 3 or 4 zones that are around all of the outlying sites in the closed park zone. So we went after money to make the short film that was in my bio that you can actually see on our website. If you just do Chaco 10 mile, that'll pop right up. And that had 6 tribal leaders, Dene leaders, 1 Dene leader, Pueblo leaders talking about why Chaco matters deeply to them. And there's no substitute, folks, for having people who are descended from the people who built a place 1,000 years ago get on film and share what matters most to them. So that we think helped get this process through under our prior Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who may be our next governor if we're all lucky, my opinion. Sorry, there's your politics. I haven't given her money. I don't have money. We need those donors, Steve. We went through this effort, and as Steve said, it hasn't yet been swept away, but we've already lost the 2 most recent monuments through executive action, and we're going to lose most of the places we want protected in the West. So now is the time to stand up and try and protect these and just do what we can in this context. Every fight we've had over 15 years or 20 years, they're all back on our door now. So in the context of this, we're balancing other things, still working with the tribes and trying to keep all these things going. But there's a lot on the plates right now.
Do you as Southwest, are you involved in any of the Utah, like Canyonlands?
We were deeply instrumental in Bears Ears National Monument. So in 2018, we held the Southwest Symposium at my museum, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And Bill Doley chaired a session with the 5 tribes that were involved in the creation of Bears Ears. And they submitted the chapter to the volume, and then Trump got elected and cut the boundaries of Bears Ears by 85%. So he revised the chapter, and then we just held on publishing long enough so that Biden could get elected, reinstate the Bears Ears thing. And then we put an epilogue in there saying it's been reinstated, which is when the thing got published in 2023. I opened the newspaper, quote unquote, every day expecting to hear that Bears Ears has been reduced again. It's gonna happen. The only saving grace right now is that the litigation from the first time it happened, was cut by 85%, is still in the courts. So yes, we will file new lawsuits if we need to, but there's still, the original issue hasn't been decided. The Antiquities Act gives presidents the permission, the authority to create national monuments. It does not give them permission to reduce the size of national monuments.
Right.
Critical distinction, I think the current administration doesn't care, but they're gonna have to argue in court. So yes, we're involved in some of that. Not as deeply as New Mexico, but somewhat in Utah.
I was wondering, I was also wondering about when the elements took over the, dugout ranch, there were a lot of sites in there. It was a private land, and then they couldn't protect it anymore,
Right.
or they sold it.
We haven't been involved in that one. I should say Bureau of Indian Affairs, we've got a big contract with them for Archaeological Resources Protection Act violations, looting on Indian lands. We get involved, we document the damage, and then we help prosecute the perpetrators when they get caught. And then last year, about this time, BIA approached us for help with NAGPRA, and what an honor, what a privilege, what a responsibility. That we are helping the Bureau of Indian Affairs get 1,100 ancestors and their belongings repatriated, we thought, from about 10 institutions, and then the new regulations came in, people had to submit inventories. We're now dealing with 57 different institutions, but on working for Bureau of Indian Affairs to repatriate those ancestors. And it's critically important work, and we're privileged, honored, embarrassed almost to be asked to participate in that, but we're not gonna take a position one way or the other. We're gonna be the technical experts, and we're gonna help them get it done, but we don't speak for tribes and we are facilitators.
We try to amplify those voices when we can. I'm doing 5 landscape projects in the state of New Mexico right now. Petroglyph, Bandelier, Chaco, Aztec, and El Malpais. And those are landscape management projects in which we are helping the parks figure out how to best manage their landscapes for basically 15, 20 years out. And we're pulling in our tribal connections to have the descendant communities have a voice in how sites and just, so-called natural things. For the tribes, natural, cultural, there is no division for them. The natural world is the cultural world, the cultural world is the natural world. And I think that's something that's a really hard thing to understand. I know as a Euro-American myself, but that is absolutely where they stand. So we're trying to amplify that voice into the way Park Service specifically in these different parks and monuments manage those landscapes. And that's its own challenge. And like Chief said, we don't speak for the tribes, but we help get them at the table. So when they start talking about things, all that information goes into our reports.
It is after 8 o'clock, folks. In the interest of self-preservation, we should probably let you all go.